Okay, a few minutes to recap stuff from our last class. So we're discussing the ideas of absolute advantage and comparative advantage, correct? Let me spend about 5 minutes just going over old material, okay? So first, let's talk about absolute advantage. And let me give you the following example. Let's say that you have two countries here. You have the US and you have Mexico. And you have two goods. Let them be apples and oranges. And let the following be true. In the US, it takes one worker to make 1 pound of apples. And let's say that in Mexico, it takes 2 workers to make 1 pound of apples. Which country is better at making apples? The US. And what does better mean? Better means that the US is capable of producing a pound of apples using fewer resources. It's easier, takes less effort to make apples in the US, correct? We then say that the US has an absolute advantage in apples. That's the meaning of absolute advantage. So we're simply looking at which country is better at making something, right? And let's say that in the US, it takes 2 workers to make 1 pound of oranges. And let's say that in Mexico, it takes 3 workers to make a pound of oranges. Which country has an absolute advantage in oranges? Again, the US. Is that correct? So this will tell us that the US has an absolute advantage in oranges as well. So the US has an absolute advantage in both goods, correct? Now, there was a time over 200 years ago when people believed that if this was the case, if a country was better than another country in everything, then there was no point in this country trading with the other country. You follow me? So if the US is better than Mexico in apples and oranges, it would make no sense for the US to engage in trade with Mexico. That was the old idea. You follow me? But then came along David Ricardo, who argued that even if a country is better than another in everything, it would still pay for this country to specialize in one of these 2 goods, leave production of the other good to the other country, and then to engage in trade. Now, I mentioned in class last time the example of the professional basketball player, correct? Now, this guy is better at playing basketball and better at lawn mowing than your average Joe. Yet, he specializes in basketball, correct? Now, what was the reason for that? Do you remember? Why does this basketball player choose to specialize in basketball? Why doesn't he mow his lawn? It's because it's very expensive for him to mow his lawn in terms of basketball given up. You follow me? Every hour that he spends mowing his lawn is an hour away from either playing basketball or practicing basketball. Either way, it translates to a lot of lost income. Correct? So his opportunity cost of lawn mowing is very high. Hence, he doesn't mow his lawn. Do you follow what I'm saying? And countries can behave in exactly the same way. Right? A country will not choose to produce something that is very expensive to produce in terms of the other good given up, in terms of opportunity cost. And that's the idea behind comparative advantage, right? So how do we define comparative advantage again? Comparative advantage, it says here, is the ability of a person to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than someone else, right? And countries and individuals really specialize in activities in which he, she has a comparative advantage, right? Now, in our story, last class, we had these two individuals, Liz and Joe. Do you remember them? Right? And they each run smoothie bars, and these smoothie bars produce either smoothies or salads. Correct? I'm not going to dwell on this example at length. I'm just going to quickly remind you of what's going on here. So Liz can produce in 2 minutes one salad, and it takes her 2 minutes to make a smoothie as well, right? And she has 1 hour of time available to her. The scarce resource in this case is 60 minutes of time, right? And Joe, on the other hand, takes 10 minutes to make a smoothie, 2 minutes to make a salad, and he too has 60 minutes of time available to him. And given this, we have these two people's production possibility frontiers, right? So let's look at Liz's PPF, the blue line. And what are the extreme points? If she devoted all her time to salads, she'd be able to make 30 salads. And if she devoted all her time to smoothies, she'd be able to make 30 smoothies, right? Joe, on the other hand, if he devoted all his time to salads, he'd be able to make 30 salads. And if he spent all his time making smoothies, he'd be able to make 6 smoothies, correct? So here are the two PPFs, right? Now, very quickly, what is the meaning of this slope? How can we interpret that slope? By the way, what is that slope equal to? Slope is equal to rise by run, is that correct? And what's the rise? That is the rise, and this is the run, is that correct? And so the slope is equal to 1. And what's the meaning of that 1? How could you interpret that 1? Do you remember? You can think of it as an opportunity cost.
For every salad she makes, she has to give up money.
Rather, for every smoothie she makes, she has to give up a salad. That's the meaning of that slope. Correct? The meaning of this slope is the quantity of the good measured on the y-axis, vertical axis, that one must give up in order to make one additional good being measured along the x-axis. Correct? And what is the meaning of this slope up here? Well, that slope, numerically, that slope is also equal to 1, right? But do remember that to calculate that top slope, the old run becomes the rise, and the old rise becomes the run, correct? But in this case, since they're both 30, that slope is equal to 1 as well. But what is the meaning of that slope? How could you interpret that slope, that top slope? It is the opportunity cost of producing one more good being measured along the y-axis in terms of the good measured along the x-axis. In other words, if you want to produce one more salad, how many smoothies would you need to give up? Liz would have to give up 1 smoothie to make a salad, correct? Let's keep this in mind, okay? And for Joe, what's Joe's opportunity cost of making an extra smoothie? Well, that would be that slope, and that slope is equal to, numerically equal to, 30 divided by 6, which is equal to 5, correct? So in other words, Joe would need to give up 5 salads in order to make a smoothie, correct? Now, to fully understand this, do remember that it takes Joe 10 minutes to make a smoothie. It takes him only 2 minutes to make a salad. So if he were to spend 10 minutes making an additional smoothie, those 10 minutes would have to come out of salads, and consequently salad production would fall by 5 salads, because in those 10 minutes he would have been able to make 5 salads. Correct? And what is this top slope equal to? Well, this top slope is the reciprocal of the bottom slope. Is that correct? It's always that. It's always the case, right? So this would be 1 by 5. And how would you interpret that 1 by 5? Well, that's the opportunity cost of making one more salad in terms of smoothies given. Correct? Now, given these numbers, who has a comparative advantage in smoothies? In other words, who has the lower opportunity cost of making a smoothie? Well, Liz, correct? Liz has a comparative advantage in smoothies. Why? Because Liz's opportunity cost of making a smoothie, which is 1, is less than Joe's opportunity cost of making a smoothie, which is 5 salads. So Liz has a comparative advantage in smoothies. Who has a comparative advantage in salads? Joe has a comparative advantage in salads, and you can work this out by comparing which two numbers? The 1, which is the opportunity cost, Liz's opportunity cost of making a salad in terms of smoothies given up, and that number is bigger than Joe's opportunity cost of making a salad, which is 1/5 of a smoothie. Is that correct? 1/5 is less than 1, hence Joe has a comparative advantage in salads. Is that right? Now, this tells us right away, this little math here, that one party cannot have a comparative advantage in both goods. It's mathematically impossible. Why is it mathematically impossible? Because if 1 is less than 5, the other numbers down here, these are simply reciprocals of the numbers on top, correct? So once you take reciprocals, the direction of inequality always reverses. Is that right? So it is impossible then for a country to have a comparative advantage in both goods, right? So now let's figure out the gains from specialization, right? So let's assume that before specialization, Liz produces at this point on her PPF. In other words, this is how Liz answers the question, what to produce. Remember that first fundamental question? Well, this is how Liz answers it. Liz decides to locate at that point on her PPF. In other words, she decides to devote half her time to smoothies and half her time to salads, thereby producing 15 smoothies and 15 salads. Right? What about Joe? Joe, on the other hand, spends the bulk of his time producing smoothies. Joe spends 50 minutes in smoothies and only 10 minutes producing salads. And since it takes him 10 minutes to make a smoothie, in those 50 minutes, he makes 5 smoothies, and he makes also 5 salads. So Joe chooses to be here on his PPF. And so what is their combined output of smoothies and salads? Their combined output before they specialize is equal to 20 smoothies and 20 salads. Is that correct? That's their combined output. Now let us have them specialize. Right? So where would we have, what would we have Liz produce? Remember, we would like them to specialize according to their comparative advantage, right? So since Liz has a comparative advantage in smoothies, we would move Liz from that point on her PPF down to this point. She produces only smoothies now, right? And where do we take Joe? We recommend that Joe specialize in salads, the good in which he has a comparative advantage. So we move Joe along his PPF upward like that to this point. And guess what happens to their combined output of smoothies and salads? These numbers go up to 30, 30. Is that right? And that clearly is a gain to society. Correct? Society has gained because those same two people can now end up producing more of both goods. Correct? Now, in terms of the PPF for society as a whole, and let me take you back some slides. So before these two guys specialized, now this is the PPF, not of these two guys, but of the whole economy, let us say. Now, when these two people were not specializing, then the output of smoothies and salads was perhaps at point H. Right? But when they specialize, production moves from here in a northeasterly direction there. Do I make sense? In other words, the economy is now capable of producing more of both goods. Right? So before these two guys specialized, we had inefficient production for the economy as a whole, that is. And when they specialize, we can move from inside the PPF to a point on the PPF. So what does specialization do then? Specialization, according to comparative advantage, leads to an improvement in efficiency in the economy. Okay? Now, let us revisit Liz and Joe, and let's look at the benefits to each of them from this type of specialization. We know that society gains, we have increased efficiency for the economy as a whole, but what about the two people themselves? Okay? So let's go back to their PPFs. Now, in order to figure out the gains to the two of them, it is advisable to view them not as individuals, but as countries. So I'm going to now think of a country called Liz and a country called Joe. Okay? Now, I'm now going to talk about something called the relative price of smoothies to salads. And before I do that, I'm going to exit this so that I can get rid of all these annotations. Okay? All right. So I'm going to now introduce a term called the relative price of smoothies to salads. And what this is it's the number of salads that equal one smoothie in value. Right? Now, country Liz, before trade, what would be the relative price of smoothies to salads in country Liz? Now, what determines the value of a product or the price of a product in a competitive market? I argue that the price of anything is largely, almost entirely even, determined by the raw materials that go to produce it. Is that correct? Now, when you look at country Liz, we find here that in country Liz, it takes 2 labor minutes to make a smoothie. It also takes 2 labor minutes to make a salad. So in terms of resource use, the two goods are equivalent. Is that right? So wouldn't you say then that the two goods should have the exact same price then in the market? You're shaking your head. Why? Didn't I just say that in competitive markets, the price of a good is almost entirely determined by the cost of production of it? Do you follow what I'm saying? Now, why did I use the term competitive markets? Because in competitive markets, firms make close to 0 profits. Now, profit, remember, is the difference between the cost of production and the price at which the firm sells the good, right? But if profits are 0, then it follows that the price of the good is almost equal to the cost of producing it. Am I correct? And the cost of producing the good is determined by the quantity of raw materials that go into producing it. Is that right? Am I making sense here? So what am I saying? I'm saying that A smoothie uses the same resources, 2 minutes, as a salad in country Liz. Therefore, I argue that the relative price of smoothies to salads in country Liz would basically be equal to this slope, which is, we've established to be 1. Is that right? In other words, one salad would equal one smoothie in value in country Liz. Am I making sense here? So let me quickly repeat. Why do I argue that the two goods would have the same price in country Liz? Because they both use the same quantity of raw materials to produce. And I have argued that in competitive markets, when profits are driven to close to zero, the price of a good is equal to the cost of producing it. Right? So since the cost of production of these two goods is the same, they would cost the same in the market. They would have the same price in the market. And therefore, the relative price of smoothies to salads, which is defined as the number of salads that equal one smoothie in value, well, that number is 1. Correct? So that is the relative price of smoothies to salads in country Liz prior to trade. What about country Joe? In country Joe, one smoothie takes 10 labor minutes to produce. One salad, on the other hand, takes 2 labor minutes to produce. So wouldn't you say then that a smoothie uses up 5 times as many resources as a salad in country Joe? And the implication then would be that a smoothie would cost 5 times as much as a salad in the market. Correct? So what would be the relative price of smoothies to salads in country Joe? It would be this slope, which we have established to be 5. In other words, 5 salads would equal 1 smoothie in value. Correct? Is that understood? So in other words, if salads were money, if you think of salads as currency, say, then what would be the price of a smoothie in country Liz? No, there's no dollars here. I'm saying consider salads to be money. So you would have to pay 1 salad to buy a smoothie in country Joe, right? And in country Liz. And in country Joe, you would need to pay 5 salads to buy a smoothie. Agreed? Okay. Now I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a different analogy here to have you understand this. Let's consider Brownsville and Harlingen, right? And we consume bread here in town, but most of that bread comes from places up north, and so they must pass through Harlingen on the way here. Now, if the highway between here and Harlingen were flooded because of a hurricane, what would happen to the price of bread here in Brownsville? If a hurricane disrupted all road traffic between here and Harlingen, places up north, essentially, the price of bread here in Brownsville would certainly rise, correct? What about the price of bread in Harlingen? Now, all the bread that's coming from places up north basically stops in Harlingen. They unload all their bread in Harlingen. Harlingen now has an abundance of bread, because all the bread that was originally coming to Brownsville now gets unloaded in Harlingen. Correct? So what happens to the price of bread in Harlingen? Goes down. So hand with my glasses, but that's the price of bread in Brownsville, and the lower price here is the price of bread in Harlingen. Brownsville, Harlingen. Now, once the flood waters recede and the highway is operational once again, what do you think will happen to the price of bread in Brownsville? Certainly come down, correct? What about the price of bread in Harlingen? That would tend to go up because now all that surplus bread that was sort of piling up in Harlingen will no longer pile up in Harlingen. Am I correct? So essentially this would happen. Bread, which was now becoming rare in Brownsville on account of the hurricane, now becomes more abundant, and hence the price falls in Brownsville. Now bread that was very abundant in Harlingen becomes less so once the highway opens up. Is that correct? So what would happen to the price of bread after the floodwaters recede? You would basically have the price of bread in Brownsville falling, that in Harlingen rising, and in the end, you would have a common price of bread in these two places. Right? Because once the highway opens up, you have a single market for bread, which covers both cities. In a single market, there is a single price. Correct? What the hurricane did is it caused the Brownsville market to separate temporarily from the Harlingen market. Hence, we have two different prices. Right? Now, the opening up of trade between country Liz and country Joe would be akin to that highway opening up between Brownsville and Harlingen. Correct? Now, once the highway opens up, once trade begins between these two places, what do you think would happen to the price of smoothies in country Liz versus the price of smoothies in country Joe in terms of salads? I'm thinking of the price of smoothies in terms of salads. I'm thinking of the relative price of smoothies, in other words. So the hand that holds my glasses here, that's the price of smoothies in country Liz, which is the other way around. That's Joe, right? So the price of a smoothie in terms of salads is 5 salads in country Joe. So that's country Joe, and this is the price of smoothies in terms of salads in country Liz, 1, right? And now once trade opens between these two places, what happens to the relative price of smoothies to salads? Settles somewhere in between 1 and 5. Am I making sense? Correct? And a number between 1 and 5 could be any number between 1 and 5. It needn't be exactly in the middle. So let's work with the number 2. Now, 2 is less than 5, more than 1. So let's say that post-trade, this is the post-trade relative price of smoothies to salads. Am I making sense here? Is that kind of understood by you? Right? For the same reason that the price of bread will fall in Brownsville and rise in Harlingen, for that same reason, once trade opens up between country Liz and country Joe, smoothies will become relatively more expensive in country Liz and relatively cheaper in country Joe. Yes? Now this is crucial. This number 2 is very important because what I'm going to say next depends on this. Okay? Now, let's recall that we have country Liz specializing where? We have country Liz specializing right here, producing only smoothies. Is that right? And we have country Joe specializing here, producing only salads. Correct? And now the gain to these two of them, to these two countries will become clear. And let's look at this very last slide here to understand that. Okay? So this is where country Liz is producing. But let's say that country Liz now decides to produce 30 smoothies, but country Liz decides to export 10 smoothies to country Joe in exchange for how many salads will she get? How many salads will she get in return? Remember, the post-trade relative prices of smoothies to salads is 2, right? So if she exports 10 smoothies to country Joe, she will in return get how many salads? Come on. Is that right? How do I get this? Because 2 is the relative price of smoothies to salads. In other words, 2 salads equal 1 smoothie in value. Right? 2 salads equal 1 smoothie in value post-trade, correct? So she will export, let's say, 10 smoothies and will get in return 20 salads. So she will be able to consume at this point. And what does this point involve? Well, after she exports her after she exports 10 smoothies to country Joe, she is left with these 20 smoothies for her own consumption. And Joe ships to her how many salads in return for those 10 smoothies? 20 salads. So basically then, Liz ends up consuming 0.20, 20. Now you notice that 20, 20 lies outside of Liz's PPF. You follow? So point 2020 is not possible for country Liz to produce. So in the old days, before she specialized and began to trade with country Joe, combination 20,20 was not possible for her to consume, because in the old days, she could only consume what she produced. Am I making sense? But what does specialization and trade enable her to do? It enables her to consume combinations that lie outside her PPF. In other words, what trade has done, specialization and trade enable Liz to expand her consumption possibilities beyond her production possibilities. Does that make sense to you? She has expanded her consumption possibilities beyond her production possibilities. Now, in the old days, her consumption possibilities equaled her production possibilities. She had to consume what she produced before trade, right? So what does trade enable her to do? Enables her to consume along that light blue line that you see there, the light blue arrow, which takes her to point 2020, for example. Right? Now, isn't that a gain to her? Would you think of that as a gain from trade? Certainly, it's certainly a gain, because she can now consume stuff that she couldn't before. She can consume larger quantities than she could before. Correct? Now, what about country Joe? Now, country Joe is producing where? Producing at this point here, producing only 30 salads. Right? So what does country Joe do? Now, remember, the goods that country Liz exports become the imports of country Joe, and country Liz's imports become country Joe's exports. Correct? These are the only two countries in our story here. So since Liz exports 10 smoothies to country Joe must import 10 smoothies. And since country Liz imports 20 salads, country Joe must export 20 salads, correct? And so this is what happens. Country Joe produces 30 salads, but then exports 20 of those salads to country Liz. This leaves him with 10 salads for his own consumption. Now, in exchange for those 20 salads, how many smoothies does he get at the relative price of 2 salads to a smoothie? 10, correct? And so this is the quantity of smoothies that now Joe can consume. So Joe ends up consuming at this point, which is point 10, 10. Yes? Now 10, 10, you notice, lies outside Joe's PPF. So what has trade enabled Joe to do? Joe can now consume outside his PPF. His consumption possibilities, too, have expanded beyond his production possibilities. And this must be a gain to him as well. Right? So what are these steps in my logic here? It's all dependent upon that number 2, which lies between 5 and 1. That's important, you see. Correct? That number 2 is what enables each country to expand its consumption possibilities beyond its production possibilities. Am I making sense here? So this is the very important argument that David Ricardo, the economist David Ricardo, made over 200 years ago, right? He said that a country could specialize according to comparative advantage and then reap these gains from trade. Right? So what is the principal gain from trade then? Can somebody tell me that in a sentence? What is the principal gain from trade? A country can consume outside its PPF. That's the gain. Do you follow me? one's consumption possibilities expand beyond one's production possibilities. That is the principal gain from trade. Understood? This brings me to the end of this lecture, and now for the remainder of this class, I'm going to do some practice problems, okay? 2 practice problems, to be precise, on comparative advantage, okay? Let us, in our first practice problem, look at the US, Mexico, apples, orange example that I gave you in the beginning of this class, okay? So what were the numbers there then? In the US, it takes 1 worker to make a pound of apples, is that correct? And so on. So I'm going to organize that information in a grid. Okay? So I'm going to organize this information in a grid like this. And the label of this chart shall be workers per unit of output. The number of workers it takes to make 1 pound of each good, basically. Correct? The 2 countries are the US and Mexico, and the 2 goods are apples and oranges. And what were the numbers, do you recall? The numbers were US, to make 1 pound of apples, takes 1 worker per pound. Is that right? Mexico takes how many workers? 2. 2 workers per pound. Right? What about oranges? US 2, Mexico 3. First question, and we've already answered this. Who has an absolute advantage in apples? The US. Is that correct? How do you figure that out? You figure that out by comparing these 2 numbers. Is that right? You compare this number, and you end up with, you figure out the pattern of absolute advantage. Is that right? Since 1 worker per pound is less than 2 workers per pound, the US has an absolute advantage in apples. What about oranges? You would have to compare these 2 numbers. Is that right? And so who's better at making oranges? Again, the US, because it takes 2 workers to make a pound of oranges in the US. It takes more workers to make a pound of oranges in Mexico. Right? And so the US has an absolute advantage in both goods. Correct? But now for comparative advantage. Now to figure out comparative advantage, you need to figure out where it is cheaper to make, let's say, apples in terms of oranges given up. In other words, where is the opportunity cost of making apples lower? Correct? The country where the opportunity cost of making apples is lower shall be the country with a comparative advantage in apples. Right? So we need to calculate a new column here, and this new column shall be the opportunity cost of making 1 extra pound of, you can go with apples or oranges, it doesn't matter. What would you like to do, apples or oranges? Now remember, you only have to do it once because, as we've discussed, if, let's say, the US has an absolute advantage in apples, it will automatically follow that Mexico has a comparative advantage in oranges. Am I correct? Right? Because I've established that it's impossible for a country to have a comparative advantage in both goods. Am I right? So you only have to do this once. Right? So what's the opportunity cost of making an extra pound of apples in terms of oranges given up in the US? How do you work this out? Well, to make an additional pound of apples in the US, how many workers would be needed? Can somebody answer that? How many workers would be needed? 1. Why? Because it takes one worker to make a pound of apples, right? Now this worker would have to come from where? Remember, workers are a scarce resource. So to devote an additional worker to apples would mean that this worker would have to be pulled out of oranges. And so there will be some reduction in orange output, which is what you need to figure out. That reduction in orange output shall be the opportunity cost in the US of making an extra pound of apples. Right? So when you pull a worker out of apples, how many oranges, or what quantity of oranges are lost? How do you work this out? Well, how many workers does it take to make a pound of oranges in the US? And I'm going to draw these two guys here, okay? The stick figures. These are the two workers that can make this 1 pound of oranges. But you are pulling how many of them out? You're only pulling this guy out. Is that correct? When you pull him out of oranges, do you lose a whole pound of oranges? No, you only lose this half a pound of oranges. Is that right? So this number here should be half a pound of oranges. Do you follow my logic? Now, next. What's the opportunity cost of producing an extra pound of oranges in Mexico? Well, in Mexico, you need how many workers to make a pound of apples? 2 workers. So you pull these 2 guys out of oranges. Now, remember that in Mexico, it takes three guys to make the pound of oranges. And you're pulling how many of them out? You're pulling this guy out, you're pulling this guy out. So do you lose the whole pound of oranges? How much do you lose? 2/3. So now you tell me, where is the opportunity cost of making apples lower? Well, which country has a comparative advantage in apples? You basically end up comparing which 2 numbers? You end up comparing these 2 numbers. Is that right? And this comparison tells us that half is less than 2/3. This means that the US has the lower opportunity cost of making apples, and this implies that the US has a comparative advantage in apples, and this automatically implies that Mexico has a comparative advantage in the other good. This must be because we've established that a country can't have a comparative advantage in both goods. It's mathematically impossible. Correct? Now, in the 5 minutes that I have left, let me give you another question much like this one. And now I'm going to, again, organize my information according to this grid quickly. And my 2 countries in this case are the UK and Portugal. And my 2 goods are wine measured in gallons and cheese measured in pounds. But the information I'll give you is going to be different. This time I'm going to say outputs per worker, not the number of workers it needs to make 1 pound of something, but rather how much can a worker make in these 2 places. And let's say that in the UK, 1 worker can make 1 gallon of wine, and the same worker can make 3 pounds of cheese. And in Portugal, 1 worker can make, let's say, 4 gallons of wine and 2 pounds of cheese. You see, this information is quite different from what we had in this chart, because here we had, what do we have here? We have here workers per unit of output. And there, in the new chart, what do I have? Outputs per worker. Correct? So let us quickly figure out the pattern of absolute advantage. Which country has an absolute advantage in wine? Which country is better at wine? Which country is better at wine? You compare these two. Portugal, why? Because a Portuguese worker can make more wine than an English worker, correct? And which country has an absolute advantage in cheese? The UK, because an English worker is more productive than the Portuguese worker in cheese. Correct? So absolute advantage is easy to establish. But now for comparative advantage. And for this, you need to work out a new column. And the new column shall be the opportunity cost of making one additional, you can go gallons of wine or pounds of cheese. Let's say pound of cheese, one additional pound of cheese. In terms of wine given up. Quickly. To make an additional pound of cheese, how many workers are needed? Well, one worker can make 3 pounds of cheese. You don't want 3 pounds of cheese, you want 1 pound of cheese. So would you need a whole worker then? How much of a worker would you need? A third of a worker. So you basically pull 1/3 of a worker out of wine, and this will result in wine output falling by how much? Now, if you pulled a whole worker out of wine in the UK, you would lose a whole gallon of wine, because that worker can make a gallon of wine. But you're not pulling out a whole worker, you're pulling out a third of a worker, so you basically lose that much, which is 1/3 of a gallon of wine. Correct? Now, Portugal. For the Portuguese to make an extra pound of cheese, how many workers will they need? Will they need a whole worker? They will not need a whole worker, because a whole worker would give them 2 additional pounds of cheese. They only want 1 additional pound of cheese, so they would need how much worker? How many workers? Half a worker. You pull this half worker out of wine, how much wine do you lose? Well, if you pull the whole worker out of wine, you'd lose 4 gallons, because that's the output of a worker. But you're only pulling out half a worker. So the wine you lose is half of 4. And the of course, is a multiplication sign. Correct? So where is the opportunity cost of making cheese lower? You basically end up comparing which 2 numbers? This third to this 2. Is that right? So you say that since 1/3 is less than 2, the UK has a comparative advantage in cheese. Do you see that? It's cheaper in terms of wine given up to make cheese in the UK, because only 1/3 of a gallon of wine need be given up. In Portugal, 2 whole gallons of wine must be given up to make an additional pound of cheese. And this, of course, implies right away that Portugal has a comparative advantage in what? Has to be the other good. Is that right? And you can work this out separately if you like. You can make another column. And in this other column, you'd have the opportunity cost of making an additional gallon of wine in terms of cheese given up. You could do that. But those numbers would be reciprocal to these numbers. So basically, in the UK, what would be the opportunity cost of making an extra gallon of wine? It would be the reciprocal of this. So there'd be 3 pounds of cheese. And what would be the opportunity cost in Portugal of making an extra gallon of wine in terms of cheese given up? It would be half a pound of cheese. You see? Right? So it automatically follows then that Portugal has a comparative advantage of wine. And that brings me to the end of Lecture 2 on Chapter 3.